Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Seraphine in the support position, and generally how Riot have handled mid lane champions ending up in the support position, because if you haven't been aware, there have been a lot of champions released throughout the years that have ended up in the support position despite being initially billed as a mid laner or potentially having a lot of players like them in the mid lane position better than they enjoyed them in the support position. And now there are actually a huge handful of these kinds of characters. Zyra, Morgana, Brand, Annie, like just off the top of my head, are champions that have all been released as mid laners or billed as mid laners or typically seen as mid laners primarily, who have ended up in the support lane and essentially have stuck there ever since. Now, obviously, this isn't entirely true. We do see these champions on occasion, especially in sort of pub games at the mid lane position, but generally speaking, their largest contributions to the game have all been in the support position rather than in the mid lane, which is where they were supposed to have been. And Seraphine is sort of the most recent champion to join that sort of group, in that she was released, she was billed as a mid laner, she was supposed to be the supportive mid laner, and then she's actually finding a decent chunk of success in the support position. There are a lot of people who are playing her support who really like her in the support position, and essentially Seraphine mains are concerned that their champion is going the exact same way as Annie and Zyra and Brand and all of these others. Now, I wanted to discuss this problem a little bit and kind of give my take on why I don't think it's as big of a problem as people are making it out to be, and generally why this is a thorny issue for Riot to avoid as a whole. First and foremost, I think the biggest problem is that Riot never release a champion forcing them to be in a particular role. And now, this is going to sound like hypocrisy immediately. I know there are some of you who are shutting off the video right now because, what do you mean they don't force champions into roles? When I played, this champion or Pantheon support, right? Everyone liked Pantheon support, he was getting played support, and Riot are saying, no, he's not allowed to be support anymore, we're going to nerf that. So, Riot are specifically trying to get champions out of roles in which they are particularly abusive or in which they have a very low amount of counterplay. In the form of Pantheon support, it was that Pantheon support was just, there was a lot of things that Pantheon support was able to do that just completely ruined parts of the lane. Enchanters were basically unplayable into Pantheon support because of how much damage he was able to do and how effective he was in just sort of being able to provide lane pressure. There wasn't as many outs to Pantheon in the support position as there are with Pantheon in the mid lane or top lane, because he's a very strong early game champion. He's able to sort of force these engagements, and a lot of support picks, and AD carries for that matter, are simply unable to contest with a champion that was designed to be very powerful in a solo lane on his own, and especially in the early stages of the game. And these situations are generally where Riot tries to get a champion out of a particular role, is when they are in those sort of particularly abusive situations where there just isn't sufficient counterplay for what they're currently doing. Camille Jungle is similar to that in that she had such a good early game that she was warping the game around her presence and just being able to totally abuse everything in the game thanks to her very efficient level 2 ganks, her very efficient early game trading, that sort of thing. And there were actually similar reasons for why Alistar Jungle was completely nerfed out of existence way back in the day because of how effective those level 2 ganks could be. Your team basically had to sit under their tower for the first 5 minutes of the game, because if Alistar came at level 2, you just died. So that was sort of a case where they're like, okay, yeah, maybe that shouldn't be something we want actually in the game. And on that note as well, Riot never try to force a champion to be in a particular role. They usually just try to get a champion out of a particular role if it is an abuse case. So, for example, Riot, when they released Kha'Zix and Vi, those were initially intended to be top lane champions. I know that sounds really weird now that we're going on to Season 11, but those were top laners. They were never intended to be in the jungle, or if they were in the jungle, it was supposed to be more of a secondary position for those champions. They could jungle, but that wasn't where they were supposed to be, and then it ended up being where they were played most often. In fact, Kha'Zix even was a mid laner for a significant period of time before he ended up going back into the jungle as his sort of exclusive role. So, Riot do not force a champion to be in a particular role. If they end up being very good in a particular role, they do kind of say, okay, yeah, we'll support this, such as in the case of Tahm Kench or Vi or Kha'Zix, all kind of ending up in a spot that they weren't supposed to be. But generally speaking, if that position seems to be relatively okay for that champion, Riot will try to keep them there. So, Seraphine in that regard she already was a very supportive mid laner. That's sort of her billing shtick, is that she can be supportive. She's not there for the damage. She's really not there to be the big carry play. Instead, she's the one who's just helping the rest of the team. She's just doing it from the mid lane position. And now, whereas a champion like Orianna, for example, is very much so more on the damage side and able to neutralize a lane a little bit easier than Seraphine can do, or Karma, who has just overwhelming amounts of early game damage, which makes her very well suited to the support position. Seraphine is a lot more in the utility aspect, which makes it a little bit harder for her to compete with some of the other mid lane picks. Which is why she kind of has also ended up in the support position, because she can get away with having slightly lower damage down in the support role. And speaking of better picks, that's another big reason for why Riot's had a problem historically keeping champions in the mid lane, even if they were designed to be there, because mid lane is a very, very competitive role. I believe it has the highest number of viable champions are playable in the mid lane. Even if we limit our mid lane pool to just mages, there are, I think, at least 24 different mid lane mages that can be played, or which are played on a regular basis. I mean, you can even think of them off the top of your head. You have the Victors, the Cassiopeias, the Ryzes, the Azirs, Xerath, Vel'Koz, lots and lots of champions that are all playable in the mid lane position. And so what that necessarily means then is that because mid lane is so competitive, and because there's so much going on with mid lane, there's so many different champions that are playable, it essentially means that only the best of the best are going to be the most viable mid lane. It just is sort of how this ends up working. If every mid laner is able to provide some utility and some damage in sort of maybe varying different amounts, but they're primarily there for their damage and maybe a little bit of their utility as well, and if every mid lane champion is like this, and they almost all are, then it becomes a question of not, do I play a champion with a little bit of damage and a little bit of utility, but which one does it best? Which one has the highest damage to utility ratios? Which one is able to do the most damage? Which one has the best sort of wave clear? There are a lot of things that you can sort of stack up, and it means that there end up being a lot of champions who just aren't in a good spot, that they just don't have very good wave clear, they don't have very good utility as compared to the other spots that they're supposed to compete against. And that leads to a situation that can be very difficult for these champions then to thrive, because there is so much competition. So sure, even though champions like Brand and Annie are sort of billed as mid lane champions, and Riot have historically tried to keep them in the mid lane, when you compare them to champions that they're supposed to compete against, they just sort of don't, because they just don't have the safety, they don't have the utility, they maybe don't even have the damage, and it just sort of becomes a question of, well, why would I play Brand mid when I could play, for example, Ryze, who is going to do Brand's job but significantly better, or Cassiopeia, who can do Brand's job and in terms of damage significantly better, and who has really good utility, better utility than Brand. It sort of becomes a very difficult question for those champions, which is why they tend to slip out of the mid lane position, because Riot do try to support them in multiple roles if they can. If those champions are being played in other roles, they sort of say, yeah, we'll try to make sure that Brand is playable mid lane and playable support. But because Brand ends up not being able to compete with mid lane champions, he sort of has less competition in the bot lane. Now, Brand obviously here being just an example. It's like this for pretty much all of the mid lane champions that have ended up in the support position more so. And support, I think, is a much lower barrier to entry, and mages provide a little bit more flexibility in the bot lane as compared to mid lane. If you're comparing a mid lane mage to a mid lane mage, there ends up being a very clear answer to who is going to be better, who is going to do the job a little bit more. Whereas in the support position, because there are fewer picks, and because mages, I think, have sort of a better niche in the bot lane, because they're sort of a more damagey variant on like an enchanter lane, you end up in a situation where mages have more of a home in the bot lane. They're sort of able to compete a little bit better, because now it's not, do I have to compete against every other mage in the game? It's, do I have to compete against the other champions that have a little bit of utility and who are able to abuse certain aspects of the support position. So Morgana and Brand, for example, are able to proc Spell Thieves very efficiently on their own because of their damage over time abilities. They have target agnostic damage. They both do max % health damage, so they're able to sort of always do damage even if they don't have a full gold income, whereas a champion like Ryze, he's never going to be able to do that. Like, a Ryze support would be terrible because he has to scale. He has to be getting a solo lane income in order to be relevant at all. Brand kind of doesn't, because of the % damage that he's able to do. There's also the question of the specific functions of utility that they're providing. A champion like Swain support may not be, particularly interesting in regards to, well, he's a champion that does some damage and has some utility, but the pullback on his passive is very, very powerful. And that's, again, a sort of damage agnostic ability that's useful for more than just Swain doing damage. It's useful because it gives him guaranteed follow-up CC. Or a champion, for example, like I totally had an example in my head and I totally lost it. But these sorts of things. Morgana Black Shield, that's the one. Where that's like a damage agnostic thing. Morgana can be useful in the game regardless of how much gold she has, because at the very least, she can always press Black Shield on a crucial target and prevent them from getting picked off, or prevent them from getting CC'd in the middle of something like a Samira Inferno trigger, for example, which just becomes very difficult for the enemy team to deal with then. All these sorts of things are reasons why a mid laner may end up being more efficient in the bot lane than in the mid lane, especially given that there's just so much less competition for that spot. If you only have to say who's better, Morgana, Annie, or Brand, well, that's significantly easier than saying who's better, Morgana, Annie, Brand, Ryze, Xerath, Vel'Koz, Ziggs, you know, like, it's so much harder to make that comparison. So at the end of the day, I do feel like it's not a question of Riot trying to force a mid laner into the support position, but them trying to make sure that the mid lane doesn't dominate the support role or is only playable in the support position. And in that regard, I do think that a lot of the champions that people have talked about, the Zyras, the Seraphines, the Brands, they're all still playable mid lane. If you like them better in the mid lane, you can always play them in that position. I feel like that's not necessarily a problem, and that a lot of people probably still enjoy doing that. So I think at the end of the day, it ends up being more of a question of, you know, do I personally like doing this, and are they at least playable mid? And I think the answer for most of these champions is yes. So I don't think Seraphine has much to worry about. I do feel like she's going to still be good at the end of the day in the mid lane. In fact, I believe the current numbers from Riot do say that she's actually more winning in the mid lane than in the support position, so you do have that going for you. But so at the end of the day, that's kind of where we're at with those champions. I hope you guys sort of enjoyed this video and this sort of look into why mid laners end up in the support position, and I hope you guys kind of understand where we're coming from. But let me know down in the comments if you think what I'm saying sort of holds true in your own games. If you guys really think that, yeah, that mid lane champion is totally not viable support, or is only viable support, let me know that down in the comments. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. Now I'll talk to you all later.